Hello everybody, this is John Cogley, and today we're going to be going over the history of pigments. I hope you can hear me and see me. Every day is a learning day, so there was quite a few questions from last time, and I wanted to go over those with you. Angela asked about what is a Primatech color, and Primatech means primitive technology. Primitive in that a lot of the pigments were ochres, siennas, etc. that were found in riverbeds, and those were processed with mortar and pestle or crushed and used as a pigment for painting. And that's been done for thousands upon thousands of years, all the way back to 40,000 years ago when it was done through cave paintings. So when we came up with the Primatech, it was to show that we were sourcing minerals and we're using modern machinery to turn those minerals into pigment and then pigment into paint. So while it ties back to tens of thousands of years, it's made with new machinery that assures the grind, the pigment size is always uniform and therefore gives the best amount of saturation of light. So that's what Primatech means. In ancient times, what people would do is they would find blacks, and the blacks were from charred bone, or they were from wood, or they were charcoal. And that was the source of blacks. And then for yellows and reds, those were oxides. And those oxides of the reds and the yellows were universally found throughout the globe. Brown was a little bit more difficult. Brown was an oxide with magnesium and was found in many places, but not all places. And the greens were the most difficult. The greens were only found in certain areas because they are associated with clay, and two types of clays in particular, silitonite and glauconite. And ite means mineral. So while they're clays, it's a mineral clay. And though they're relatively scarce, but that's what gave the greens. They were found in Germany and a very limited amount of places. That's kind of the story of the Primatech colors. Angela F. asked, what are the light fast times? And as I went over last time, Angela, for excellent, it's a 1 or 100 plus years. For 2, which is very good, it's 100 years. For fair, a 3, it's 50 to 70 years. And for fugitive, which is a 4, that's for 15 to 20 years. So what that means is in full sunlight. If you put it in a back room or away from full sunlight or behind UV glass, the pigment and the painting will last much longer. Angela asked about environmental friendly and what does that mean? Well, as we went over last time, Daniel Smith has 3 environmental friendly colors. We have red, brown, and yellow. And we buy those from a company that goes where there was mining, and the mining has polluted streams, and they reverse all of that damage. They clean up the streams, they clean up the site, and then they sell the iron oxides as a way to recoup their costs. So while it costs me more as a manufacturer, it's a great way to give back to the environment and make sure that we all live in a very clean and safe place. And that's why they're called environmental friendly. Claudia had a question. Hello, Agus. Hello, Rick. Claudia had a question, and that was on Venetian red, Italian red, and French red. Well, these are all different types of places where natural ochres are found. And the natural ochre takes on a different shade depending on the minerals that it's associated with. So while they're all ochres, they're all different shades because of the areas that they come from. So chemically they're very similar, but they're different in their shades. And I can give you a sample or an example of that. Okay, so this is Kingman Turquoise. This is Sleeping Beauty Turquoise. You can see that they're very different in their shade. Both of these minerals come from Arizona, one from the Kingman mine and one from the Sleeping Beauty mine. And the reason that they have different shades is because the minerals that are associated with areas. So even in the state of Arizona, these two mines aren't that far from each other. They're different shades because of the different minerals that they're associated with. The same thing would apply to the Venetian red, the Italian red, and the French red. Because they're associated with different minerals, they get different shades. Hello, Joy from Florida, and Sally from Durham, North Carolina. Donna asked about watercolor ground and watercolor ground being used on canvas. The watercolor ground will turn any substrate into a watercolor substrate. So it depends on how porous the material you're applying it to is. Canvas, if it's non-size, can be extremely porous, and therefore canvas may take 1 or 2 coats or a thicker coat to be able to fully coat it and allow it to be a substrate for the watercolor. So it depends on your substrate and how porous it is. That will determine how much watercolor ground you need to put on it. Debbie asked about Pigment Blue 15. So, answer Debbie's question. So, Pigment Blue 15 is phthalo. And really, there is no Pigment Blue 15. Each one of the PB15s or the phthalos is a shade of PB15. So, for example, when Debbie asked the question, it was a great question. What is PB15:1? That means shade 1. Well, that's red shade. And what is PB15:3? Well, that's green shade. And PB15 shade 6:6, well, that's a special pigment of the PB15 or PB16 that's used to make certain other colors. One of our newest colors is PB16, and it's Phthalo Blue Turquoise. It's actually a very beautiful color, and that's PB16. So, Debbie, fantastic question. I hope that helps you. It's also interesting to note that how different a shade can be. For example, last week we talked about buff titanium, and buff titanium is PW, pigment white, number 6, shade 1. So PW6:1, and that's buff titanium. Titanium white, which is very, very, hello Jansen, which is very, very bright, is PW6. So just the shade difference gets you from titanium white, very, very bright, to buff titanium, a very off-white. So that shade really, really matters. The other difference between those two, and it's just a shade difference, is that the Titanium, buff titanium, is a granulating color, and the titanium white is a non-granulating color. Yet they're both the same pigment, but a different shade. And once you get into shade, you're really getting into some really heavy chemistry. Beautiful chemistry, not to be afraid of, but pretty heavy chemistry. Mark B asked about manganese blue. And it was a great question, Mark, thank you. So I read all of your questions afterwards. I read and I try to get back to each one of you individually. And then some of them are such interesting questions that I think that all of you might want to know. So I put them down for the next talk. So Mark asked, manganese blue, why is it not around anymore? Well, Daniel Smith never used manganese blue. We use a version of PB15, again, a phthalo, and it almost dead matches what used to be manganese blue. And the reason that every reputable pigment company moved away from manganese blue is there were serious environmental issues with it. So people may say manganese blue, but manganese blue is no longer used. It's going to be some type of a phthalo or some type of a mix. And for us, it is a version of PB15. Great question. Tanya asked about pigments used in the car industry. We talked about that. We talked about that last week. And how many of the colors in the car industry actually make it over to art companies? It's actually a very small percentage. And that is because the car companies, the pigment manufacturers, make a huge amount of colors for the car industry. The thing about those colors is they're soluble. They're meant to disperse with solvents. And for a watercolor company, we also make oils and other materials. But for watercolor, the pigment must disperse within a watercolor matrix. So when we find a color that we really like from the automobile industry, it takes a huge amount of time to be able to convert that to be dispersed in water. And because we have chemists and because we have a full laboratory, we can do that. However, it's a very time-consuming process. So while there's a lot of colors available in the automobile industry, very few of those make it over to the art side of the house. We've actually brought quite a few out in terms of being compared to other companies. Many more, but still it's very small compared to the car industry. So Tanya, that was a fantastic question. It's good to see all of you too. I appreciate that you watch. So now I thought I'd talk about some pigments. And again, should you have questions and you've got really great questions, leave them in the stream and I'll read them and I will get back to you. So cerulean blue, there was some questions about cerulean blue last time. And cerulean blue is actually a cobalt. It's a cobalt standard, kind of a salt. And it was introduced in 1860. It's stable, it has a great light fastness, but it doesn't have the richness of a cobalt blue, for example. Green earth, questions were about green earth. Green earth is a natural color. It's been used since antiquity, and it's called a hydrosilicate, and has different shades of that green earth depending whether it's associated, again, within the environment of iron or magnesium or aluminum or potassium. The elements that it's around can really change what a color looks like. Indian yellow, I'm sure some of you know this. Indian yellow has animal origin. In the 15th century, in India, rural India, cows were fed mango leaves. The urine was collected. It was purified, and it was used to make Indian yellow. That practice stopped in the 19th century and hasn't ever been used since. Now it's a synthetic, and it's a very beautiful color. Hello, Carolyn from Scotland. Hello, Marlene Liu. It's been forever. Good to see you too. Another interesting color from a historic standpoint is Tyrian Blue, or Tyrian Blue. And do any of you know where Tyrian Blue originates from? It actually comes from squeezing the gland of a mollusk. And it comes out with like a creamy substance that's purified. And depending on how long it's laid out in the sun, it can go from a red to a purple. Again, not used anymore, more of a historic kind of interesting pigment. So Lydia says she uses Indian yellow almost every time she paints. It's a beautiful color. Mummy brown. Mummy brown's interesting in that the history says it was made from mummies. And although there's a history that says that, there's never been a known case where it was ever used in a painting. However, interesting. We have mummy brown. It does not come from mummies. It's a synthetic. Cochineal red. Cochineal red comes from beetles, and it becomes a dye that was very popular. In fact, it was used by the Aztecs. It's a very beautiful type of red, and it was, I didn't know this, but in my research, it was second in terms of money for the Spanish Empire. Right after silver was cochineal red. Very, very interesting. Madder or rose madder. We used to make rose madder as a color. Rose madder is a fugitive color. Hello, Thomas. It's a fugitive color. It's made from the madder root. And the madder root is boiled, which makes a dye. That dye is then put over what's called a metal halide. And once it goes over top of the metal halide and binds, a lot of chemistry involved, but it ends up binding, then it's considered a pigment. And that's what rose madder is made from. It's considered a pigment. It's actually what's called a laked process, L-A-K-E, laked process. And it's fugitive because you can never make a dye permanent. They're always going to be fugitive. So rose madder, while very pretty and having a historic basis, was very fugitive, and we no longer make it. Now we have a permanent rose madder by taking several pigments, high-performance pigments, and integrating those. It's very close to the rose madder, but it's permanent. So today I thought we'd go over quinacridones. Hello, Raffaele. How are you in Italy? So quinacridones. Quinacridones come from their synthetic. They're high-performance colors. They have great light fastness. I know for many of you, they're certainly in your palette. Quinacridone Gold, Quinacridone Burnt Orange. These are all extremely popular colors. They were made by, they were actually made in 1958 by DuPont. DuPont started them. And they were made for the car industry. They're absolutely beautiful, beautiful colors. And they all come from, and I'll see if you can see this. I know it's a little bit difficult to see. But they all come from a 5-ring structure. And that's why they're called quinacridone. Quin means 5, or 5 rings. And it's because of these alpha and beta particles and where they go on the ring structure that you get the varied colors. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful colors. The only bad things about quinacridones is that once the car industry, which is the biggest purchaser of them, no longer likes a particular color and doesn't buy it, then it's no longer available to the industry. So we buy about 15 years worth, so we always have it. Hello, Linda Doll. Cobalts. We talked about cobalts last week, and cobalts were actually used in about 1530. So they've been around for a long, long, long time. They're present in the mining process. So cobalts were used in pottery up to 2,600 years ago. So they're around a really long time. The Chinese Empire used them. They were used in Europe. So really a long, long time. Mayan blue. Mayan blue is a really interesting color. And I wanted to, we have Mayan red, Mayan yellow. We have several Mayan colors. And only one do we call Primatech. And that is the Mayan blue. And that's because it has a pedigree. It was used by the Mayans, who found if they could infuse indigo into clay and then put that into a furnace, they had a very, very stable color. Many of the Aztec ceramics are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years old, and they're still as bright as the day they were made. It is a phenomenal, phenomenal color. So while we have other colors other than the Mayan blue, only the Mayan blue is within the Primatech. Cadmiums. So cadmiums are interesting in that, it was a question about cadmiums. Cadmiums don't exist in nature. Cadmium ore exists in nature, and when highly processed, you can get cadmium. We stopped using cadmiums about 5 years ago. And the reason is because they're not environmental friendly. So we use high performance synthetic pigment to have the same vibrancy and opacity that you'd get from a cadmium. And it's just safer for the artist, it's safer for the environment, and all around it's the best way to be able to do it. Hello, Tammy from New York. Lunar Black. Lunar Black is a very interesting color, as we talked about last week. It is a single pigment. It is called Pigment Black number 11. And it's like Mars Black, but it's a different shade of that particular pigment. It's magnetic, and the particles are so small they repel each other. We kind of broke our rule a little bit with Lunar Black. Normally when something is a single pigment, we name it after the company or chemistry house that created it. But it looks so beautiful to us. It looked like the landscape on the moon or Mars that we called it lunar black. And we have some other colors that are lunar. We have lunar earth. And again, you can see this beautiful, beautiful granulation. We have lunar violet. Again, beautiful granulation. We have the lunar blue. Again, beautiful, beautiful granulation. Now, these three in particular, the lunar blue, lunar violet, and lunar earth, are mixtures of pigments, whereas the lunar black is one pigment. So very interesting. And I have the cadmiums in front of me, and I kind of wanted to show you the cadmiums. This is cadmium yellow, and you can see it's a very, very, very bright color, and it has great opacity. And this is Cad Yellow Deep, and again, you can see it has great opacity and great brightness. I did bring some of the quinacridones with me. So someone's asking about smalt, and I will come back to Carmen about smalt. And also Egyptian blue. So these are some of the quinacridone colors. We have 14. This is only what I brought for me from work before we were put into quarantine. This is the Quin Fuchsia. Quin Deep Gold. Quin Purple, the last one we brought out. Quin Purple. Quin Burnt Scarlet. Quin Coral is my baby. I love it too, Alexandra. Quin Violet. Quin Rose. Quin Red. Quin Sienna. Quin Lilac. Quin Pink. Some of you asked about opera pink and is there a substitute? Really, there's never a substitute for the opera pink because it's such a highly vibrant color. It's a fugitive color, but it's highly, highly vibrant. If I was going to say what else could you use that would be a 1 or 100 plus years, it would be either the quinacridone pink, or it would be, from a Primatech standpoint, it would be the rhodonite. But neither one's going to match the color saturation of the opera pink. This is quinacridone gold. Probably in the US, the most popular color. This is quinacridone magenta. This is quinacridone coral. And this is quinacridone burnt orange. So Stella, this is what you just asked about your favorite color, quinacridone burnt orange. Quinacridone burnt orange, probably outside of the US, is the #1 color because artists use the Quin Gold and the Quin Burnt Orange as a way to blend. They're just quite beautiful colors. So some of the questions I just saw go by, and they were really good questions, was about smalt. And smalt is a very difficult, smalt and Egyptian blue are very difficult colors if you're trying to start from scratch. You can buy them as pigments well, you can buy smalt as a pigment. But when we tried to make it, the smalt and the Egyptian blue turned to glass. And so what do I mean by that? When we approached these two colors, we looked at the history of them. And hello, Linda Dahl. We looked at the history of them and tried to make them from their constituent components to make them into a pigment, and then from the pigment, make them into a paint. We had a great deal of trouble with smalt. And then Egyptian blue, there really is no Egyptian blue. It is unbelievably difficult to try to make that pigment. And we, in our laboratory, we have furnaces. And our furnaces, they're electric furnaces. And if you put it, for example, at 410 degrees Fahrenheit, it will stay at 410 degrees forever. And what we found out is that's not the way the Egyptians did it. The Egyptians used fire from wood, for example. And with wood, temperature goes up and then it comes down. They stoke it up, it comes up, and then it goes down. And we could never work out how to have that up and down in temperature to be able to have the Egyptian blue not turn into glass inside of our furnace. So sometimes what the ancient populations did was just brilliant, brilliant. It's been lost through history, but it was absolutely brilliant. The artists before us, the technicians before us were quite brilliant people. There was a question that was asked about quinacridones existing within the Primatech. You can never get a quinacridone within the Primatech, and the reason being the many constituents of the quinacridone don't exist at the same place, and putting together the quinacridone is extremely difficult. Last time I was told it's about $20 million to make a quinacridone, and the steps are just incredible to try to make it. One of the other questions was, well, why would you ever run out of a quinacridone? Why doesn't somebody else make it? It's very similar to the pharmaceutical companies. The big companies that make these pigments will patent every possible chemical structure. So you can't make it. They will bring you to court, because if you try to turn the molecule one way and say, well, now it's a different molecule, they've already done it. They have brilliant people working for them, and they're quite astute about how to protect themselves. So, Rosemary's watching. Wow, small Egyptian blue. Raphael, the granite more with tap water. So one of the other things I wanted to show you was on, and I think we'll tap on this idea next time. So Jennifer says oxygen levels in Egyptian blue as well. That makes perfect sense, because the more you have in terms of fire that doesn't go up and down, the more oxygen you would deplete. It's actually quite it's quite interesting. So one thing I want to go over next week with you is light, both reflected light and refracted light. And those give you as the artist what you see. One thing I was thinking about before I started was the beauty of watercolor. The one thing I always love about meeting with you individually or in groups is, one, you're wonderful people. Two, you come from many diverse backgrounds. Many of you are retired doctors, scientists, and I'd love to learn from you. The one thing that's really interesting, and if we could teach our young people about this, would be so great, is there's really no need to be afraid of physics. There's no need to be afraid of chemistry, because when you paint, especially with watercolor, especially with any type of color, what you're playing with on the paper is chemistry. And what you're seeing when you see that beautiful color develop is the reflection and refraction of light, which is all about physics. So art really puts all those three components together and can really show a passion and a love. And it's not something to be feared. It's something to be engaged upon. So, you know, my hat goes off to all of you, because watercolor and art itself is such a great way to put those three components together. The other thing about watercolors is when I give a presentation of watercolors and I let people know that we're going to see the swatches and discuss color, oil colorists and acrylic artists will come. And people always say, well, why do they come to see watercolor? Actually, what they come to see is color. And the one thing that you see as a watercolorist that acrylic artists and oil colorists don't see is you really get to see what the pigment looks like. The only thing holding the paint together is gum arabic. And once that's dried out, what you really see on your paper is you're seeing the pigment in its most raw form. So when a oil colors looks at it, at their medium, or an acrylic artist looks at their medium, the oil colorist is seeing the refraction and reflection through a linseed basis, and the acrylic artist is seeing it through a polymer matrix. And those change the intensity and the color that they see. Whereas you as a watercolorist really are seeing the pigment in pretty much all of its glory. So it's really neat for anybody to attend the sessions to learn about color. That's kind of where we all meet in the art world, is about color and pigment. Love of chemistry and love of art, they're all fantastic. You can see it on the page. Joy says she hated science, but now, yeah, you use science every day, and especially as an artist, you're blessed with being able to see colors many people can't see, and the nuance of color, and all that is about physics, and all that is about chemistry. So it's such a beautiful thing. And Ness is saying hi to everybody. Hello, Ines. How about making some sort of Daniel Smith event gallery? Thanks for sharing the passion. I love sharing my passion. Thank you for allowing me to share my passion. And again, some of the questions that I didn't answer were in the feed, and I tried to get back to each one of you personally. Sometimes that takes a little while, but I will always get back to you. So don't hesitate to ask a question. I really enjoy them, and I enjoy answering them. Paul, I talk about the Quinacridone Colors. So some of you ask about how to pronounce quinacridone. It's quinacridone. And they're all the five ring structures. And depending on where the alpha and beta particles go on that structure, gives it the unique colors they have. Yeah, chemistry is always important. Even when you're making fudge and brownies, it's important. You know, we're using it. We make sure how much of each thing we're using. So we use chemistry all the time. It's nothing to be afraid of. I remember talking to it was like 6 months. Which one is the best pig? You know, the best way to the majority of the quinacridones are transparent, but the best way to look at all the colors is on the color chart, because we list that really quite openly to allow you to make the best choice possible. So it would be on the color chart. And if you have any questions about which colors, I'd be glad to, Ellen, what I'll do when I read the feed, I will send you back. If you don't have the color chart, I will answer your question on the feed and get back to you. I love being able to meet with all of you. So, you know, I love the questions. Will you do a session on iridescent colors? You know, I will do a session on iridescent colors next week. So we call the iridescent colors the luminescents. And the reason we call them luminescent is within that family, we have the duochrome, we have the iridescent, we have the interference, and we have the pearlescent. Each one is different, mainly depending whether the matrix they're on is a mica matrix or a silica matrix, or it's using a titanium as a reflection or refraction. In fact, what I will go over next week, and this is on the Daniel Smith site, and you can just look up on the Daniel Smith site, 3-dimensional color and interference pigments. I'm sorry, this is backwards, but it's 3-dimensional color and interference pigment, and we go over every single one of the properties and how it affects color. So if you want to read that before we talk next week, I will go over this next week with you. If you want to read it before next week, you'll be able to ask me more questions, but it's a beautiful, beautiful article. And one more time, that's called Three-Dimensional Color and Interference Pigments. And I will go over that next week. I tried to download the color chart. It was so small I couldn't read it. Joy, let me check on that. I will call the webmaster and see what they can do about that. Pearlescent shimmer is something. Pearlescent is really, it's very interesting. A lot of artists, well, many artists, use it to get the shine in our eyes. If you look at our eyes, they pick up the light so well, but when you watercolor, sometimes it's called dead eye. And to put a little bit of the interference or a duochrome in the eye makes the eye come alive. Which colors display the most granulation? By far, the colors that have the most granulation are the Primatech. And that's because the Primatech, granulation is caused usually by differential specific gravity. That means the pigments within it, the particles within the pigment, have different weights. And that really leads to, except for Lunar Black, that leads to the granulation. And the ones that have the most amount of that are the Primatechs. They are by far going to be the most granulating. However, as we talked about a couple of minutes ago, the lunar colors are highly granulating. The reason that the lunar colors are highly granulating is they have more than one pigment. If you look on your color chart, you'll see that they are comprised of more than one pigment. And those pigments have different specific gravity and different weights, same thing, and so they move through the water matrix differentially, which causes granulation. Hello, Tiho. I've been watching your Facebook. I hope your legs are better. Do you make liquid lead? No, Caroline, we don't make liquid lead. We don't do that. Could you please manufacture more luminescence in the 5 mil? I'm going to find out from my support partner here for a second. Do we have any of the luminescence in 5 mil?
Yes, we have 6 of them now.
And who's?
Jean Haynes.
So I just checked with my partner across from me, and we have 6 of the colors in the Jean Haynes set. If you wanted to try them out yourself in 5 mil, they're in the Jean Haynes set. There's 6 of them. I love lunar colors too. On what paper do you paint your supplies? So when we do our drawdowns, I take these from my chemist. It's called proofing the batch. He gets the batch ticket, he or she. I have 2 chemists. And they will make a batch in the laboratory. And while we have 5-ton mills on the floor, we have a very small one in the laboratory. Everything on our manufacturing floor is in micro size in the laboratory. And so they'll make a very small batch, and then they will test it. And if it meets the test, then they give the batch to the floor. So what my chemist likes to use is a 140-pound cold press Lana Aquarelle. And the reason that he likes that, he tells me over and over, is that the sizing on the Lana Aquarelle is very, very consistent and has been for decades. Whereas the Arches paper, which is a very, very, it's a good paper, it's a beautiful paper. However, from time to time, what many artists will tell you, and what we have seen ourselves, is if you wet the paper and hold it up to the light, you can see there's certain places where the sizing didn't completely cover. And when we want to do drawdowns, we want the same sizing over and over and over again. And Lana Aquarelle does that perfectly. We don't sell it. I don't get anything if you use it. It's just the paper that we use. So I hope that answers your question. Yes, Moonglow is composed of 3 pigments, as is shadow violet, and because of that, they have great granulation. There is something to always think about granulation, and the reason you just don't add colors to try to get it, and that is, for us, when we make a color for, say, Moonglow or Lunar Violet, we really have to be, you have to be very knowledgeable about how those pigments are going to work with each other, because if you're not, then from tube to tube, you can get a different color, a different hue, because what you're seeing is what colors are on top of each other and which ones are just slightly below each other. So it's really understanding the pigment to make a color that granulates, but granulates with the same behavior over and over and over. And that's just a great deal of time and experience to be able to make that happen. Yeah, Lana Aquarelle, I don't know, as there's probably as good, if not better, papers for an artist to use. Just for us, because we're not creating an artwork, we just want to see how the paint is going to lay down, and is it the same as the paint that we made before? Does it have the same saturation? For us, that works well. So I'm not saying from a paper that you might use for your artwork, just to answer the question of what we use to do the drawdowns. Eamon is watching. Hello, Eamon. I'm trying to look for your questions. I don't know how to go backwards. So next week we will go back to go over the luminescent colors. And if there's any questions you have on the Primitex, please ask me and I will explain those more. So people ask, what are some of the things when you look at pigments? When I look at pigments, when my chemists look at pigments, what we talk about is what is organic, what is inorganic, which I'll go over next week. I'll go over that in more in length. What is synthetic and what is natural. For example, we can make water, H2O, in the laboratory, and it would be the same as, except for mineral content, it'd be the same as the water that's coming down from the sky, rain. So just because we make it in the laboratory doesn't mean it's a synthetic. It's just made synthetically. Whereas there are other things we call synthetic from a chemistry standpoint because they don't exist in nature. Quinacridones be one of those, because you have to be able to put things that don't behave well or don't exist in nature and manipulate them. We would call those synthetic. Okay, I kind of hope that answers some of the questions. So one of the questions that was asked on the feed was, is there a difference between Mars black or bone black, can they be made synthetically? They can be made in the laboratory, so they can be made in the laboratory, and you would see no difference between what you would have outside the laboratory. So sometimes it's just ease, or it's a purity standpoint. For us, it's always about purity. So we always want to make sure any pigment we're using, except for the Primitex, are extremely pure, have the same size and shape, for example, especially if they're just a pigment or single pigment. Can we watch this live? Yes, you can watch it live. So when I'm done, I will we'll publish this. So I know for many of you it's bedtime. So yes, I'll post it and you can watch it at your leisure. Joy, thank you. I enjoy answering questions and I'm glad you like it. I love pigment. There's many of you that really love the pigment. As artists, I always find that you're really inquisitive, and if this will help you, then fantastic. Yes, so I'm sure it's very early in Thailand. It's hard reaching out and making sure it works to everybody. So please watch the stream, and I'd love to hear what you have to say. I'll read your comments, but thank you for coming. Gina, Cascade Green. Yes, Cascade Green is one of those unique pigments that we talked about last time. It's a co-precipitated pigment. It's two pigments that are bound together that you can actually unlock with water and then see the patterns of that particular color. So it's a very beautiful color. Sarah, thank you for bringing me joy. Thank you for saying that, Sarah. I appreciate it greatly. You are all very generous, and I appreciate it greatly. So I think it's getting late for many of you. Please add on to go to the feed, ask your questions. I will get back to you. I enjoy it. Next week, we'll talk about so Caroline, let me answer that question offline. It's about pigments under cold wax polish. I would have to think about that. Next week, we'll talk about the luminescent colors. Again, there's the pearlescent, the duochrome, the iridescent, and the interference. And I'll get some samples of those so you can see those. And if you ask something, I'll write it down to make sure everybody hears about it at our next one. Thank you all very much, and I wish you a great night or day as it may happen to be. And I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you all very, very much.